The engine did not fail in a way that demanded attention. It did not stop. It did not cease. It ran, unevenly. A note in the vibration felt slightly off, a change in sound that only appeared after prolonged operation, only under load, only when the aircraft was already committed to the air. On the ground, it passed inspection because wartime inspections were built to catch collapse, not deviation. What could still fly was allowed to fly. What did not yet break was considered acceptable. Once airborne, the discrepancy became clearer. Throttle response lagged. Temperature crept upward during climb instead of stabilizing. Fuel mixture behaved inconsistently across altitude transitions that manuals treated as neutral. None of this triggered immediate danger. All of it undermined confidence. The machine was no longer fully predictable, yet it remained functional. Doctrine assumed that such a state was temporary, that the engine would either correct itself through continued operation or reveal clear failure. Neither happened. The aircraft remained caught between categories that doctrine depended on. Pressure built around that uncertainty. Missions could not be postponed for marginal engines. Replacement schedules followed logistical rhythms, disconnected from frontline demand. The aircraft was expected to perform as designed, even when conditions eroded the assumptions behind that design. Fuel quality varied. Ambient temperatures shifted without warning. Maintenance intervals stretched beyond intent. In this environment, engines that required precision began to falter first. This one did not. It resisted collapse by resisting optimization. The response did not come from command. It came from proximity, a subtle change in how the aircraft was flown. Power was no longer advanced aggressively. Throttle movement slowed. Climbs were shallower. Cooling was managed continuously rather than assumed. The engine was treated less as a source of maximum output and more as a system under cumulative stress. It was allowed to remain within a narrower band than doctrine prescribed. Performance declined slightly. Reliability improved markedly. This behavior violated expectations, not regulations, but assumptions. The aircraft no longer chased ideal engagement profiles. It arrived later. It climbed slower. It avoided regimes that forced the engine to prove itself. In combat planning, this appeared as underperformance. In operational reality, it appeared as continuity. The aircraft flew when others were grounded. It returned when others overheated, ceased, or failed without warning. The contradiction between doctrine and outcome widened. Manuals emphasized exploitation of available power as a means of survival. The fix relied on restraint. Where performance was extracted, failure followed unpredictably. Where performance was moderated, endurance emerged. The engine did not become stronger. The system around it became more tolerant of its limits. That tolerance translated into persistence. Maintenance crews began to notice secondary effects. Internal wear patterns stabilized. Damage accumulated gradually instead of catastrophically. Bearings degraded evenly. Cylinders resisted sudden failure. These outcomes were not the result of improved parts, but of altered use. Engines treated gently aged. Engines pushed to design limits failed abruptly under wartime conditions that no design specification fully represented. The aircraft ceased to be exceptional in reports because its effectiveness was not expressed in victories or engagement statistics. It appeared as availability. It was present for missions others missed. It completed flights others aborted. In theaters where recovery options were limited and mechanical failure equated to loss, this presence mattered more than marginal increases in speed or climb. Command structures did not immediately recognize the shift. Performance charts still favored peak output. Enemy assessments still prioritized theoretical capability. But operational planning began to adapt silently. Aircraft with stable engines were assigned tasks that demanded reliability over aggression. Long transits, poor weather flights, roles where failure carried disproportionate cost. The aircraft continued to fly. Ridicule followed initially. A plane flown below specification was seen as wasted potential. A pilot avoiding full power was considered cautious. The term wrong was applied not to the engine itself, but to the behavior surrounding it. Only over time did the pattern become difficult to dismiss. Missions conducted without loss accumulated weight. The laughter softened into indifference. Indifference became acceptance. The fix remained informal. It was never codified as procedure. It spread through habit rather than instruction. Pilots watched which aircraft returned. Crews noted which engines lasted. Adjustments were copied without attribution. The behavior embedded itself below the level of doctrine. It became part of how the aircraft was understood rather than how it was described. As operations intensified, the value of endurance increased. Losses strained replacement systems. Training pipelines lagged behind attrition. Aircraft that continued operating under strain exerted influence beyond their individual presence. They reduced the rate at which units collapsed under mechanical pressure. They preserved experience. They stabilized sortie rhythm. The engine fix did not grant superiority in combat. It granted continuity under pressure. That continuity altered planning assumptions. Missions began to rely on availability rather than capability. Schedules tightened where reliability held. Where aircraft could be counted on to return, operational tempo increased without announcement. Enemy forces responded to presence, not explanation. Aircraft that appeared repeatedly over contested zones forced reaction even when they avoided decisive engagement. Resources were committed without resolution. Fuel was burned. Crews were scrambled. Absence of failure became a form of pressure. The aircraft did not dominate the air for moments. It occupied the operational space persistently. This persistence disrupted attrition logic. War planning expected loss curves to follow contact. When machines did not fail on schedule, projections blurred. Replacement cycles missed their trigger points. Decisions waited for absences that did not arrive. The system adjusted slowly, absorbing uncertainty without understanding its source. Over time, reliability assumed strategic weight without being named as such. Aircraft that kept flying under degraded conditions imposed costs indirectly. They denied clarity. They extended engagements without resolution. They forced the opposing system to remain engaged indefinitely. This form of pressure did not resemble traditional combat success. It accumulated silently. The engine remained imperfect. It never matched specification again. It did not need to. By ceasing to be forced into failure regimes, it continued to function. And because it functioned, the aircraft remained in service. Because it remained in service, it shaped the rhythm of operations around it. Across the broader conflict, such adaptations multiplied without coordination. Not innovations, but refusals to collapse. The war increasingly depended on systems that tolerated stress, rather than systems that excelled briefly. Machines that survived extended pressure outperformed machines optimized for ideal conditions. The fix was not mechanical in the strict sense. It was relational. It changed how expectation interacted with reality. The engine was no longer required to meet doctrine. Doctrine adapted around what the engine could consistently deliver. That adaptation moved quietly through hangars and cockpits, carried by repetition rather than argument. As campaigns prolonged and certainty eroded, this behavior gained leverage. Reliability simplified planning. Simplified planning accelerated tempo. Accelerated tempo redistributed pressure. None of these effects were dramatic in isolation. Together, they reshaped operational balance without drawing notice. The aircraft that kept flying did not announce its significance. It simply returned, mission after mission, under conditions that silenced others. And as it did, the meaning of success shifted subtly, away from performance peaks and toward sustained presence, even as the war continued to demand more from every system involved. The effect of that presence extended beyond the aircraft itself. It altered how risk was distributed across the unit. When a machine could be relied upon to return, contingencies elsewhere narrowed. Escort plans simplified. Weather margins tightened. Commanders adjusted expectations not because doctrine changed, but because reality repeated itself with enough consistency to be trusted. Trust replaced assumption. That shift alone reduced friction across operations. Reliability became cumulative. One flight proved little. Dozens without loss reshaped perception. The aircraft stopped being discussed in terms of limitation and began to disappear from conversation entirely. Silence replaced evaluation. What no longer required attention gained operational invisibility, and that invisibility freed cognitive and logistical capacity for other pressures. In war, what does not demand constant correction becomes leverage. Opposing forces encountered the result without understanding the cause. Aircraft appeared, withdrew, returned again according to patterns that resisted prediction. Intercepts produced effort without conclusion. The absence of mechanical failure denied the feedback cycles upon which countermeasures depended. Analysis expected breakdown to follow stress. Stress accumulated. Breakdown did not. The discrepancy forced a widening of safety margins on the opposing side. Those margins carried cost. Fuel reserves were consumed earlier. Patrol durations shortened. Readiness postures extended without discharge. None of these effects registered as loss. They registered as fatigue. Fatigue altered tempo quietly. Reactions slowed. Decisions deferred. The environment adapted around an assumption of endurance that was never articulated. Inside the unit, the fix hardened into routine. New pilots absorbed it without context. They learned how the aircraft was flown, not why. Throttle discipline was demonstrated, not explained. Cooling was managed by feel. The engine's limits became common knowledge without documentation. This knowledge resisted formal capture because it contradicted performance ideals. It persisted because it worked. Maintenance practices aligned naturally. Inspections shifted focus from finding justification to replace engines toward monitoring gradual wear. Gradual wear was manageable. Catastrophic failure was not. Predictability replaced surprise. Predictability enabled planning. Planning preserved operational continuity in an environment built around disruption. As industrial output increased and newer machines arrived, the lesson did not disappear. It transferred. Engines with higher potential carried tighter tolerances. Without restraint, they failed spectacularly. With it, they endured. The specific fix evolved. The principle remained. Systems survived when operators accepted reality over expectation. The laughter that had followed early deviations ceased, not because it was disproven publicly, but because repetition drained its relevance. No argument was required once outcomes stabilized. Aircraft returned. Crews survived. Missions continued. Dissent evaporated into routine behavior. This pattern revealed a truth that war rarely acknowledges directly. Stability is power when pressure is constant. Spectacle draws attention. Continuity shapes outcome. The engine fix belonged to the second category. It removed a predictable endpoint. By doing so, it interfered with planning rhythms built around collapse. Removing collapse does not announce victory. It enforces patience on the opposing system while preserving momentum on one's own. Over extended campaigns, this imbalance deepened. Systems designed to respond to loss found none. Systems designed to escalate engagement found no closure. The aircraft's ongoing operation became an environmental factor rather than an event. It shaped decisions indirectly, simply by remaining available when expectation assumed absence. In historical distance, such adaptations fade into background noise. They lack authorship. They resist attribution. Yet they underpin endurance. Wars of scale are not won by isolated triumphs alone, but by the side that can continue functioning when the difference between effort and return narrows. The engine that did not fail on schedule contributed to that function by refusing to conform to failure models embedded in planning. What historians later describe as industrial advantage often rests on countless such decisions. Restraint rarely receives credit because it produces nothing new. It preserves what already exists. Preservation, extended over time, accumulates force quietly. The aircraft that kept flying exemplified that accumulation without ever signaling it. And as pressure mounted across theaters, as systems strained to meet expectations written for different conditions, those quietly preserved machines became anchors. They allowed operations to proceed without renegotiation. They narrowed uncertainty. In doing so, they shaped the contours of sustained conflict in ways no single engagement ever could. That anchoring effect rarely appeared in reports because reports favored incidents over continuities. Command structures tracked events. They reacted to losses, breakthroughs, failures, and extraordinary success. They were less equipped to notice the absence of those signals. Yet absence was precisely what began to matter. When an aircraft did not drop out of rotation, when a sortie did not require replacement planning, when a crew did not need reassignment due to mechanical loss, pressure redistributed invisibly across the system. Over time, that redistribution produced asymmetry. One side expended attention managing unpredictability. The other expended less effort compensating for collapse. That difference did not curve the conflict suddenly. It tilted it incrementally. Each avoided failure eliminated a cascade of secondary decisions that normally followed loss. Logistics did not scramble. Command did not reassign. Training pipelines did not accelerate to cover gaps. The system conserved not only machines, but organizational energy. The aircraft's presence became normalized. Normalization is decisive because it sets baselines. Once reliability becomes baseline, expectations harden around it. Planning becomes more assertive. Routes extend. Coverage assumptions expand. Missions overlap with fewer buffers. All of this happens without directive, driven by confidence formed through repetition rather than instruction. Opposing planners experienced this shift only through depletion of options. They confronted an adversary that remained active under conditions where traditional calculations predicted attrition. Attempts to compress timelines yielded no visible payoff. Escalation increased exposure without forcing resolution. The conflict adopted the texture of sustained friction rather than episodic confrontation. For pilots operating within this environment, judgment evolved. Skill ceased to be measured solely by aggression or pursuit. It moved toward resource management. The engine was not a constraint to be overcome, but a variable to be protected. That protection did not reduce combat effectiveness in aggregate. It expanded it across duration. Each preserved sortie added weight to continuity. Each return reinforced expectation. From the outside, nothing appeared exceptional. Engagement outcomes remained mixed. Victories and losses still occurred, but underneath, one constant diverged: availability. The aircraft remained. Its systems aged predictably instead of catastrophically. Predictable degradation was not feared. It could be monitored, planned around, delayed. Catastrophic failure demanded reaction. Reaction consumed margin. As campaigns stretched longer than initial projections, this distinction grew sharper. Early war assumptions about turnover eroded. Machines were expected to fail and be replaced. When failure did not arrive, replacement capacity freed elsewhere. Pressure eased indirectly. The side with preserved assets did not need to accelerate production or training to compensate. Its systems breathed more easily under load. Nothing about this undermined danger. Combat still punished mistakes ruthlessly, but it removed an entire category of loss from the equation. Mechanical self-destruction declined. Enemy action remained the dominant risk. By narrowing risk sources, operators could focus on fewer variables. That focus improved outcomes marginally, repeatedly, over time. The engine fix, once ridiculed, became indistinguishable from competence. No one defended it openly. No one challenged it either. It survived by becoming mundane. Mundanity is how effective practices persist under institutional pressure. They stop being debated and start being assumed. In that assumption, war proceeded differently. Not faster, not slower, more evenly. Evenness favors endurance. Endurance favors accumulation. Accumulation reshapes balance without spectacle. And so the aircraft that continued flying did more than complete missions. It stabilized a portion of the war's machinery. Stability does not attract attention in conflict. It attracts reliance. Reliance reallocates power quietly, leaving decisive markers only visible in hindsight, long after the noise has faded. When historians later searched for inflection points, this sequence rarely surfaced. It produced no spike in claims, no dramatic reversal of momentum, no signature engagement that could be isolated on a map. Its effects were distributed instead across planning tables, maintenance cycles, crew rotations, and supply forecasts. It functioned below the threshold where narratives usually form. Yet beneath that threshold, it exerted steady influence. The aircraft remained a known quantity. That mattered. Known quantities reduce friction. Friction is the enemy of tempo. Where friction declines, systems move with less resistance. Orders propagate faster. Assumptions stabilize. Layers of contingency thin. None of this is visible in a single sortie, but it alters how entire organizations breathe under strain. Opposing forces were forced to respond to presence rather than performance. Presence demanded vigilance. Vigilance demanded allocation. Allocation consumed resources even when nothing happened. Fighters scrambled, fuel burned. Crews put on alert for encounters that resolved into nothing more than separation and return. The psychological cost of unresolved contact accumulated differently than loss. It lingered. It demanded explanation without offering closure. Over time, this unresolved pressure distorted prioritization. Analysts were trained to react to outcomes. When outcomes stopped arriving predictably, analysis lost its compass. Was the threat growing weaker, or merely behaving differently? Was escalation required, or restraint? Without clear signals, decisions flattened into maintenance of posture. Posture without progress drains initiative. From the cockpit, the shift felt subtle. There was no proclamation that doctrine had changed. Only fewer moments where engines were pushed to failure in pursuit of marginal advantage. Only more returns that felt unremarkable. The extraordinary became routine. Routine became expectation. Expectation reshaped risk tolerance. Maintenance culture adapted in parallel. Predictable where replaced sudden failure. Components were inspected with intent to preserve rather than to explain breakdown. Forecasts became usable rather than reactive. The aircraft did not demand heroics from mechanics. It asked only consistency. Consistency scaled where improvisation could not. This interaction between restraint and endurance reflected a broader truth of industrial war. Systems win not by exceptional moments alone, but by reducing the frequency of collapse. Every collapse forces reorganization. Every reorganization diverts energy from pressure. The engine fix reduced collapse frequency. It did not change the nature of combat. It changed its rhythm. That rhythm carried forward. As newer machines entered service, the lesson survived indirectly. Engineers widened tolerances. Trainers stressed judgment alongside procedure. What had been learned in silence influenced design, without attribution. The fix disappeared as an identifiable act, absorbed into philosophy. By the time war ended, no ledger recorded how many missions occurred because an engine was not pushed too hard, how many crews survived because restraint replaced insistence, how many plans held because a machine returned when it was expected to fail. These numbers exist only as absence of loss, absence of interruption. This is why such stories resist neat endings. They do not culminate. They persist. Their impact is not found in moments, but in the space between moments that remain connected when they otherwise would not be. In that connection lies the larger significance. The plane that kept flying reshaped the conflict by stabilizing one small part of it. Stability compounded across time. Time is the decisive currency of prolonged war. Those who can spend it without collapse dictate terms to those forced to race against depletion. The laughter faded because it no longer explained reality. What replaced it was not admiration, but dependence. The system depended on engines that endured. Dependence is stronger than belief. Belief shifts easily. Dependence rewrites behavior. And so the engine fix, wrong by doctrine, proved right by consequence. Not because it delivered advantage in any one engagement, but because it denied failure its usual cadence. By doing so, it removed a clock from the battlefield. And without that clock, the war moved on terms that no one had planned for, but everyone was forced to accept. That acceptance altered behavior long before it altered understanding. Crews stopped bracing for the inevitable moment when a machine would simply not return. Planning models stopped reserving silence in their margins. Silence had been a variable. Now it was reduced, not eliminated, but pushed farther out in time. That distance mattered. When failure is expected soon, decisions compress. Risks are taken rapidly. Assets are spent with urgency because delay promises nothing better. When failure recedes, choices stretch. There's room to wait, to shape conditions, to let pressure accumulate instead of detonating it. The aircraft that endured created that room. In this way, a technical adjustment became an operational influence without ever passing through doctrine or declaration. No briefing announced that limits had changed. No manual stated that endurance had become preferable to demonstration. And yet behavior aligned around that reality because repeated outcomes left no alternative interpretation. War tends to reward what can be named and repeated, but it is governed just as strongly by what quietly works and therefore spreads unannounced. The engine fix belonged to that latter category. It did not persuade through argument. It persuaded through return. One landing after another, it substituted evidence for explanation. Over time, units came to rely on that pattern even while lacking language for it. Aircraft that behaved this way were slotted instinctively into plans where persistence mattered more than contrast. Long coverage, narrow margins, repeated presence over the same ground. The system learned where such machines belonged without ever formalizing why. This quiet sorting reshaped force employment indirectly. Other aircraft absorbed tasks that demanded short bursts of performance. The enduring machines absorbed tasks that demanded continuity. Together, they formed a composite capability more resilient than either type alone. But it was endurance that tied the sequence together. Endurance closed gaps. Endurance made schedules predictable. Endurance narrowed uncertainty. Uncertainty is what opponents exploit. Remove it, and adversaries are forced into reaction rather than initiative. The aircraft that kept flying reduced uncertainty not by intimidating the enemy, but by ceasing to surprise its own system. Predictability at home created pressure abroad. None of this depended on recognition. It depended on repetition, on the fact that each successful return reinforced assumptions until those assumptions hardened into planning reality. Eventually, the idea that the aircraft might simply disappear between missions lost urgency. That loss of urgency reshaped attention. Attention drifted elsewhere, and attention, once removed, is difficult to recover. The fix did not make the plane invulnerable. It made it ordinary in the most dangerous way possible. Ordinary presence, repeated without collapse, forces adaptation more effectively than dramatic gestures ever achieve. It denies opponents the event they are preparing for. It denies them release. And so the influence persisted. Not dramatic, not decisive in isolation, but intolerably consistent. In long war, consistency outlasts brilliance. It does not need to win arguments. It only needs to remain. It remained precisely because it demanded nothing extra from the system. No surge in parts. No revision of training syllabi. No shift in rhetoric. Only continued operation within limits that had always existed but had rarely been respected. That quiet discipline proved scalable in ways innovation often is not. As pressure accumulated across theaters, scalability became decisive. Solutions that required explanation slowed diffusion. Solutions that required permission stalled entirely. But a behavior that simply reduced disruption migrated on its own. Crews noticed fewer emergencies. Schedulers noticed fewer gaps. Commanders noticed fewer apologies embedded in plans. No one needed to ask why to continue doing what evidently worked. This altered the emotional temperature of operations more than reports could convey. When machines fail unpredictably, anxiety permeates every calculation. Even successful missions carry residue of fragility. When machines persist, that residue thins. Focus shifts outward. Attention returns to terrain, timing, coordination. The internal question of whether the aircraft will hold fades into background assumption. That fading is operational advantage disguised as calm. Calm does not announce itself. It simply allows sequences to unfold without interruption. In sustained campaigns, uninterrupted sequence is leverage. It enables overlap. It enables anticipation. It enables resource flow that is not interrupted by replacement cycles or sudden reallocation. The aircraft that flew when others fell silent reordered effort by refusing to consume attention. Opposing forces experienced this refusal indirectly. They prepared for collapse that did not arrive. They waited for attrition curves that flattened unexpectedly. Planning documents aged faster than reality. Adjustments lagged behind conditions because the signal they were calibrated to detect never appeared. The absence of collapse distorted priority systems. That distortion is rarely recognized as an effect in itself. Yet organizations are built to respond to defined triggers. Remove the trigger, and response mechanisms idle. Effort does not vanish. It disperses. Focus shifts incrementally away from the anomaly that refused resolution. The aircraft did not need to overwhelm. It needed only to persist long enough to be absorbed as background. Once absorbed, it shaped behavior without resistance. Patrols adjusted around it. Intercepts accounted for it without urgency. Countermeasures were planned, then delayed, then deprioritized. Each step made sense locally. Collectively, they granted space. Space is what endurance buys. Within the originating units, the lesson required no rhetoric. Survival teaches faster than doctrine. Pilots trusted machines that returned. Trust altered posture. Flew again rather than pushed. Maintenance crews protected what protected them. These loop behaviors reinforced one another. The culture shifted quietly, anchored not to belief, but to outcome. Eventually, the distinction between ideal and actual operation faded in practice, if not in text. Manuals remained. Exams were passed. But daily behavior reflected a deeper calibration drawn from experience. Limits were known intuitively. The machine's voice replaced abstract targets. That intimacy between operator and system increased tolerance for imperfection while reducing catastrophic loss. This intimacy did not romanticize the machine. It stripped it of myth. Engines were no longer symbols of dominance. They were mechanisms whose cooperation mattered more than their defiance. Such demystification rarely features in heroic narratives, yet it is fundamental to endurance in industrial war. When viewed across the full span of operations, the engine fix becomes less a solution than a pivot point in how effort was applied. It redirected energy away from forcing outcomes and toward maintaining conditions. That redirection conserved momentum. Momentum sustained pressure. Pressure without interruption reshaped the battlefield without drawing attention to itself. Histories often search for decisions where intent meets impact. This was not one of those moments. Intent was modest. Impact was cumulative. The aircraft did not change what was possible in a single engagement. It changed what could be assumed over many engagements. Assumption is the silent architect of strategy. Because this shift occurred without declaration, it resisted reversal. There was nothing to rescind. No order to countermand. No program to defund. The behavior persisted because it was already embedded. Practices that embed without announcement are the hardest to uproot. By the time systems adapted consciously, if they ever did, the advantage had already been converted into routine. Routine defines baselines. Baselines shape expectations. Expectations govern reaction. The aircraft that endured pressed on these layers, simply by continuing to exist where failure had been forecast. And so the significance lies not in the fix itself, but in what it revealed under pressure. That resilience emerges not only from strength, but from alignment. That systems endure not by exceeding limits, but by recognizing them early enough to avoid collapse. That the quiet refusal to push harder can, over time, prove more decisive than any single act of force. The plane kept flying. Others fell silent, and in that simple divergence, sustained long enough, the logic of the war bent subtly away from spectacle and toward continuity. Continuity, once established, altered the scale at which consequences appeared. Effects that were invisible at the level of a single sortie accumulated across weeks of uninterrupted operation. Routes normalized. Timetables stabilized. The airframe became a constant rather than a variable. Constancy simplified coordination, and simplified coordination reduced friction across every adjacent process. What did not break did not demand explanation. This reduction of friction mattered most where the environment was least forgiving. Remote fields, marginal weather, extended distances where diversion options were theoretical rather than practical. In such places, the difference between an engine expected to falter and one expected to return shape behavior before contact ever occurred. Crews prepared with confidence that did not require bravado. They planned for execution instead of contingency. That difference carried through decisions that followed. Opposition encountered the byproduct of this confidence as unpredictability, not because behavior was erratic, but because it did not align with the failure timelines on which countermeasures relied. Intercepts met aircraft that behaved conservatively, yet remained present. Pressure existed without escalation. Effort expended without resolution. The picture refused to sharpen. In operational terms, that refusal delayed adaptation more effectively than surprise ever could. Over time, the presence hardened into assumption on both sides, but with different consequences. For the originating units, assumption reduced cognitive load. For the opposition, it eroded urgency without granting clarity. Preparation continued. Response continued. Outcome did not. Planning adjusted toward management rather than correction. Management is resource-intensive and yields no closure. The engine fix never required validation because it never announced success. It simply removed a predictable endpoint. Removal of endpoints changes how organizations think. Without collapse to react to, systems drift toward postponement. Postponement accumulates cost invisibly. The aircraft did not impose cost directly. It induced it by extending uncertainty. This extension mattered most as the conflict matured. Early phases tolerate volatility. Later phases magnify the cost of disruption. As supply lines lengthened and replacement cycles slowed, continuity became leverage. Not because it produced advantage in isolation, but because it preserved optionality while denying it elsewhere. Within the units that practiced restraint, optionality remained broad. Engines that held allowed planners to choose rather than react. Choices reshaped tempo. Tempo sustained, constrained alternatives on the other side. None of this required superiority. It required absence of failure. Absence proved harder to counter than strength. Viewed without urgency, the shift reads plainly. A system accustomed to collapse had one of its collapses removed. Everything built around that expectation adjusted imperfectly. Some adjustments compensated, others misfired. All consumed attention. Attention is finite. Where it is drawn matters. The aircraft that endured drew attention away from itself. That was its quiet advantage. It became background. Background conditions change outcomes without being credited as causes. They shape the field on which visible events occur. By the time analysts seek explanation, background has already done its work. Nothing about this requires a heroic frame. It does not elevate individual will over structure. It shows the opposite. Structure rewards behaviors that reduce strain. In industrial war, strain is the natural enemy. Reduce it, and systems persist. Persist long enough, and persistence becomes control. The engine kept running because it was allowed to. The aircraft kept returning because it was not forced to prove itself. And in a conflict defined less by decisive moments than by sustained presence, that allowance carried weight far beyond the machine that embodied it. Presence, sustained without escalation, reshaped the environment in subtle ways. It altered how space was perceived. Airspace, once considered intermittently contested, became continuously occupied. Not dominated, not cleared, simply inhabited. Occupation without confrontation forces adaptation more slowly, but more deeply than sudden engagement. It shifts assumptions incrementally. Incremental shifts are harder to reverse. Units operating under this condition stopped framing missions as exceptions. They became routines. Routine is stability's visible form. When routines persist under threat, threat loses its ability to command urgency. Decisions flatten. Priority queues lengthen. Everything still functions, but nothing resolves. The lack of resolution becomes its own pressure. On the ground, this translated into a different calibration of effort. Fighter coverage was expected rather than requested. Reconnaissance windows aligned with predictable presence instead of narrow opportunity. Logistics adjusted to maintain flow rather than replace loss. Each adjustment made sense locally. Together, they formed a system less reactive and more inertial. Inertia favors whatever continues without drama. Opposing planners experienced the inverse. Their systems were tuned to detect degradation. When degradation did not appear, detection yielded noise instead of signal. They monitored more closely. Reports multiplied. Analysis grew cautious. Caution delayed commitment. Delay preserved the very condition creating uncertainty. The loop reinforced itself. In such loops, advantage accrues to whatever does not require attention. The aircraft ceased to require it. By functioning within reduced demand, it minimized its footprint on decision-making. That absence of footprint did not make it invisible. It made it constant. Constants reshape equations long before they are noticed. War rarely rewards constants immediately. It tolerates them until adaptation lags. Lag is cumulative. Each instance of delayed adjustment adds friction. Friction draws energy. Energy expended without effect erodes confidence. Confidence erodes coherence. Coherence, once compromised, cannot be restored quickly. None of this depends on superiority in the conventional sense. It depends on survivability extended over time. Survivability does not announce itself as victory. It announces itself as continuity. Continuity alters baselines. Once baselines shift, everything measured against them follows. The engine fix did not change what the aircraft could do in ideal conditions. It changed what could be expected repeatedly. Expectation governs planning more decisively than capability. A capability used once impresses. An expectation met consistently reorganizes behavior. When systems reorganize quietly, credit disperses. No doctrine claims responsibility. No command cites revision. Practices persist because outcomes align with need. Over time, the original deviation fades from memory. What remains is a new normal that no longer feels exceptional. In that sense, the laughter that once greeted restraint becomes irrelevant. Ridicule depends on contrast. When restraint becomes background, contrast disappears. The behavior no longer challenges identity or ambition. It simply functions. Function ends debate faster than argument ever could. What endured was not a technique, but a relationship between pressure and tolerance. Pressure remained high. Tolerance increased just enough to absorb it. That balance sustained motion where collapse had been expected. Sustained motion changes the story of conflict without rewriting it overtly. At scale, wars are not only decided by who strikes harder, but by who remains present when conditions erode certainty. Presence accumulates influence without forcing acknowledgement. It becomes the frame within which other actions are evaluated. The aircraft continued to fly. Others intermittently did not. Over time, those absences mattered more than any single engagement. They shaped where plans could rely on continuity and where they could not. That distinction guided allocation, response, and attention across the wider system. The engine fix was never meant to matter beyond its immediate context. It mattered because it aligned behavior with reality rather than assumption. In doing so, it reduced internal contradiction. Systems with fewer contradictions waste less energy. Wasted energy is attrition in another form. What finally emerges, when the arc is viewed whole, is not a story of ingenuity overcoming limitation, but of limitation acknowledged and managed. That management extended operational life. Extended life altered tempo. Altered tempo reshaped pressure. And pressure, sustained without interruption, influences outcomes long before they are recognized as such. The aircraft that kept flying did not redefine warfare. It revealed how wars are sustained. Through choices that avoid failure rather than chase perfection. Through systems that value continuity over display. Through restraint that looks passive until its absence becomes decisive. In that realization, the fix takes its true place, not as a solution celebrated, but as a condition endured. And in wars measured not by moments, but by persistence, endurance becomes the quiet axis on which everything turns. Persistence, once normalized, alters how loss is interpreted. When failure stops being routine, every failure that does occur draws disproportionate attention. It feels anomalous rather than expected. Anomaly provokes investigation. Investigation reshapes process. In this way, continuity not only preserves capacity, it sharpens sensitivity to disruption elsewhere in the system. Over time, this sensitivity feeds back into design and training indirectly. Engineers, observing fewer catastrophic breakdowns and more gradual degradation, begin to emphasize serviceability and margin, not through declarations, but through preferences. Specifications drift. Safeguards appear. Operating guidance grows quieter, less absolutist. The lessons migrate without ceremony. What had been an improvised response to pressure becomes an embedded assumption about how machines should be treated under strain. The aircraft no longer exists at the edge of its envelope by default. It exists slightly inside it. That interior space absorbs uncertainty. Absorption prevents cascades. Cascades are what systems fear most. In conflicts defined by scale, cascades, not single failures, reshape outcomes. Removing one initiation point for cascading breakdown can stabilize an entire operational chain. The engine fix acted in this way. It did not make the machine immune. It made collapse less likely to propagate. That alone justified its persistence. Seen from afar, this looks like conservatism. From within the system, it feels like control. Control that does not demand constant correction. Control that allows planning to proceed without recalculation at every turn. In environments saturated with variables, such control becomes decisive precisely because it is unobtrusive. The significance, then, lies not in the engine or the aircraft as isolated objects, but in how expectation governs large systems under prolonged stress. When expectation shifts from failure to endurance, behavior reorganizes around that belief. Belief alters allocation. Allocation alters tempo. Tempo defines pressure. Pressure sustained unevenly favors whatever adapts fastest to duration rather than intensity. Intensity exhausts. Duration transforms. Wars that extend over time reward those who manage, whereas carefully is firepower. The fix aligned practice with this reality long before it was acknowledged formally. This alignment did not produce sudden change. It produced continuity. Continuity rarely attracts attention. It does not announce itself with markers or milestones. Yet it quietly determines which systems remain functional when others degrade. Function, preserved across cycles, becomes influence. The aircraft's continued presence did not demand recognition. It imposed adjustment. That adjustment rippled outward, from cockpit to maintenance line to planning desks that recalibrated without knowing why. Over many iterations, small recalibrations accumulated. Accumulation is how structural change occurs, without directive. In historical hindsight, such changes are difficult to isolate. They leave few documents. They generate no decisive correspondence. Their evidence lies chiefly in absence. In machines that did not fail when models predicted they would. In operations that continued on schedule. In pressure that did not dissipate. Understanding this pattern requires stepping beyond narratives of optimization and breakthrough. It requires recognition that endurance often grows from restraint, that managing limits can yield more durable outcomes than exceeding them. In industrial warfare, where machinery and human systems intersect continuously, humility toward material reality proves as consequential as ambition. The aircraft that kept flying became a quiet reference point, not because it excelled, but because it persisted. Persistence altered the distribution of attention. Attention governs action. Action defines conflict. This chain does not rely on spectacle. It relies on time. And time, once shaped by systems that refuse to collapse on schedule, becomes its own form of power. Time does not announce when it has shifted from constraint to asset. It becomes apparent only after systems begin to behave differently under identical pressure. Responses lengthen. Margins widen. Decision loops stretch without breaking. What once demanded urgency now tolerates delay. That tolerance is not complacency. It is adaptation to a new baseline. With endurance established as norm, planning logic recalibrates subtly. Command structures grow less reactive, more positional. Resources are allocated with confidence that continuity will hold. This confidence reduces the impulse to overcorrect. Overcorrection introduces instability. Stability, once earned, resists that impulse. The engine fix, trivial in isolation, contributed to this stability by disarming a recurring source of uncertainty. Mechanical unpredictability is corrosive. It forces conservative planning upstream and frantic adjustment downstream. Removing even one unpredictable variable strengthens the whole chain. Strength, in this context, is not force. It is coherence. As coherence spreads, systems tolerate asymmetry better. They absorb losses without systemic shock. They resume function without exhaustive realignment. This favors prolonged operations not because they are easier to execute, but because recovery costs diminish. Recovery is where time is lost. Over extended campaigns, the distinction between losing time and losing material grows sharper. Material can be replaced. Time compounds. Systems that preserve tempo without escalation gain advantage, simply by remaining on schedule while others reset. The aircraft that kept returning preserved tempo through mechanical reliability rooted in restraint. This restraint altered expectations about wear. Wear became something to manage rather than fear. Managed wear marks time without marking collapse. It produces signals that can be planned around. Collapse produces noise that disrupts everything. In this environment, the value of predictability eclipses the appeal of peak output. Peak output creates moments. Predictability creates spans. Spans define operational space. Control over operational space allows influence without confrontation. Influence sustained reshapes outcomes quietly. Such influence does not require acknowledgement. It operates through cumulative presence. Aircraft that appear repeatedly narrow adversary options simply by requiring response. Response consumes capacity. Capacity, once drained persistently, erodes flexibility elsewhere. This erosion is rarely dramatic. It is rarely reversed. The larger pattern mirrors other systems under stress. Whether mechanical, organizational, or strategic, systems fail not when pushed once, but when pushed repeatedly without recovery. Interrupting that accumulation of stress changes trajectories. The fix interrupted it locally. Local interruption scaled through repetition. What began as adjustment to necessity evolved into a stabilizing habit. Habits, once established, outlast the conditions that produced them. They become default behavior. Default behavior sets boundaries within which ambition operates. Those boundaries define sustainability. Sustainability is not a visible advantage. It offers no single moment of triumph. It creates a condition in which triumphs remain possible longer. In contests decided by duration, this matters more than isolated superiority. The war progressed through phases of escalation and exhaustion. Systems that endured exhaustion gained latitude. They could wait. Waiting is a luxury in conflict. It allows choice. Choice determines initiative. The aircraft that flew within its limits granted that luxury repeatedly, not by defeating opponents outright, but by refusing to remove itself from the contest prematurely. Each return affirmed the same principle. Limits respected extend participation. Over time, this participation reshaped patterns of expectation and response on all sides. Plans accounted for sustained presence. Absence no longer served as trigger for opportunity. Pressure normalized. Normalized pressure is profoundly disruptive. It deprives opponents of climax. Without climax, momentum dissipates. Operations blur into routine. Routine demands maintenance rather than inspiration. Maintenance privileges systems that endure. Endurance, rewarded implicitly, becomes strategic currency. This currency does not circulate visibly. It accumulates through repetition and denial of failure. The engine fix was one such accumulation point. It created no doctrine. It generated no headline. It simply persisted. Persistence, under prolonged conflict, becomes indistinguishable from control. Control exercised without assertion is difficult to counter. It offers no focal point. It resists escalation. It forces adaptation without granting resolution. In this sense, the aircraft did not symbolize ingenuity. It embodied alignment. Alignment between what the machine could sustain and what was demanded of it. That alignment extended useful life. Useful life extended operational relevance. Relevance sustained pressure. Pressure, quietly sustained, shifted balances no one explicitly set out to change. Systems adjusted around it. Decisions were delayed or softened in its shadow. Energy diverted to accounting for a threat that refused to peak or collapse. This refusal defined its significance. Not triumph, not dominance. Refusal to fail on expected terms. And that, in the arithmetic of extended war, proved enough to matter. That arithmetic does not simplify with time. It grows more complex as layers accumulate. Each additional cycle reinforces assumptions built on continuity. The longer systems operate without rupture, the more they invest in the belief that rupture will not arrive unexpectedly. Investment shapes posture. Posture shapes intent. Intent, once moderated, rarely returns to its earlier extremes. Plans become calibrated rather than urgent. Escalation thresholds rise. Actions are spaced rather than compressed. This spacing alters tempo not by slowing operations, but by smoothing them. Smooth operations conceal strain until it migrates elsewhere. The engine fix continued to function as a quiet regulator within this process. It prevented strain from concentrating at the point where failure would have immediate consequence. Instead, stress distributed gradually across the system. Distributed stress is easier to absorb. It does not trigger alarms. It does not force radical correction. It erodes alternatives subtly. As alternatives narrow, choices converge around preservation. Aggressive action becomes harder to justify when the existing state holds. Waiting appears rational. Waiting benefits the side whose systems endure intact. Thus, endurance converts directly into leverage over time. The aircraft's continued operation exemplified this dynamic in its purest form. It presented no solution to be countered. It offered no vulnerability to exploit. It simply remained available. Availability drove planning confidence. Confidence reduced contingency overhead. Reduced overhead freed capacity for parallel tasks. Capacity multiplied effect elsewhere. Opposing systems responded by widening their own margins. Wider margins demanded more resources to maintain readiness. Readiness without engagement consumed fuel, focus, and personnel. Consumption without payoff degraded morale incrementally, not through shock, but through repetition. In such conditions, friction becomes cumulative. Minor delays compound. Small inefficiencies align. Systems built around decisive resolution struggle when resolution fails to arrive. They bleed effort sustaining posture instead of converting it into outcome. The fix, still unacknowledged, continued to deny resolution. Each routine return reaffirmed that denial. The absence of mechanical failure normalized expectation. Normalized expectation dulled urgency. Urgency is not synonymous with effectiveness. But in war, urgency maintains coherence across layers that otherwise drift apart. When urgency fades unevenly, coherence erodes. Commands hesitate. Coordination loosens. Initiative fragments. The aircraft's reliability contributed to this erosion indirectly, not because it weakened opposition directly, but because it undermined the timing assumptions upon which opposition responses relied. Reaction cycles desynchronized. Counters arrived late, or not at all. Threat perception blurred. Blurring benefits endurance. Clear threats invite targeted response. Persistent threats invite management. Management prioritizes sustainability over resolution. Sustainability favors systems already optimized for it. The engine fix had done precisely that. By lowering immediate performance demands, it optimized the system for length rather than peak. Length absorbed pressure. Pressure exerted influence quietly. Over extended theaters, these effects aggregated. Not every squadron adopted the same practices. Not every engine benefited equally, but enough did to alter averages. Averages shape command perception. Perception guides allocation. Allocation favored units that remained operational without constant recovery. These units received missions that assumed continuity rather than contingency. Their operational footprint expanded not by superiority, but by dependability. Dependability reshapes authority. Units trusted to return exert influence disproportionate to their formal status. They become anchors within planning. Anchors stabilize formations. Stability enables projection elsewhere. Thus, a local mechanical adjustment cascaded upward through planning logic without ever being recognized as cause. Its effect remained diffuse. Diffuse effects resist attribution. They persist because they are never challenged directly. Challenges require targets. The fix provided none. It did not alter the silhouette of the conflict. It altered its rhythm. Rhythm governs endurance. In the long view, wars are not decided solely by who can strike hardest, but by who can remain engaged longest without exhausting capacity. Exhaustion arrives through accumulation of small failures more often than through decisive defeat. Removing even one failure pathway delays exhaustion significantly. The aircraft that kept flying did not eliminate risk. It narrowed it. Narrowed risk made operations habitual. Habitual operations replaced exceptional effort. Exceptional effort cannot be sustained indefinitely. Habit can. As habitual endurance became embedded, it influenced training implicitly. New personnel adopted conservative handling without questioning origin. Origin was irrelevant. Outcome was visible. Engines lasted. Aircraft returned. These outcomes shaped culture quietly. Culture governs default behavior. Default behavior governs resilience. Resilience defines how systems respond to uncertainty. By the time uncertainty might have forced reevaluation, the system had already adapted around continuity. Reevaluation became unnecessary. The absence of disruption appeared natural. Naturalized endurance is the most overlooked force in conflict analysis. It generates no flashpoint. It draws no attention, yet it underwrites the ability to act when others pause. The engine fix belonged to this category of force, not because it was ingenious, but because it aligned behavior with reality. Reality does not reward insistence on ideals. It rewards adjustment to constraints. In adapting to constraint, the system gained room to maneuver elsewhere. Maneuver does not always require motion. Sometimes it requires simply remaining present when others cannot. That presence accumulated meaning slowly. It shaped expectations, actions, and responses across layers. It imposed a steady tax on opposition planning. It preserved optionality for its own side. Optionality is strategic oxygen. Systems deprived of it commit prematurely. Premature commitments accelerate exhaustion. Exhaustion invites collapse. The fix delayed that trajectory. It did so without drama. It did so without recognition. It did so by allowing imperfection to persist, rather than forcing correction at all costs. Imperfect systems endured. Perfect ones broke when conditions diverged. That divergence was constant in prolonged war. Conditions rarely matched specification. Systems tolerant of variation thrived. Tolerance became advantage. Advantage translated into time. Time reshaped conflict. By the end, what mattered was not how fast an aircraft could climb, or how sharply it could maneuver at the edge of its envelope. What mattered was that it continued to exist within the battle space, while others cycled out. Existence sustained influence. Influence compounded. Compounding shifted balance. The laughter that once dismissed restraint faded into irrelevance, not because it was disproven publicly, but because reality ceased to validate it. The aircraft flew. Again and again. In a wider frame, this pattern was not isolated to one airframe or one front. It reflected a broader adjustment that unfolded across an industrial war stretched beyond its original assumptions. The conflict was fought not only through bursts of innovation and moments of tactical clarity, but through prolonged exposure to strain. As the war lengthened, margins narrowed everywhere at once. Fuel degraded. Parts wore beyond planned cycles. Crews rotated faster than experience could fully settle. Under those conditions, systems that demanded perfection exhausted themselves quickly. What endured instead were systems that accepted variance as normal, not because they were inferior, but because they were compatible with reality. Engines tolerated uneven fuel, inconsistent maintenance, shifting climates. Units survived not by forcing machines into doctrinal ideals, but by allowing them to operate within their actual physical limits. This adjustment happened unevenly, quietly, and often without formal sanction, yet it shaped the practical capacity of forces engaged across multiple theaters. Seen historically, the episode illustrates a turning point less visible than any major battle. It marks the moment when endurance became as decisive as innovation. Industrial war is governed by continuity. The side that can remain present, operable, and predictable to itself gains leverage, not through singular superiority, but through cumulative pressure. Presence fills time. Time constrains opponents. Constrained opponents make reactive choices. Reactive choices rarely reshape outcomes. The aircraft that continued to fly embodied this logic. It did not change the balance through confrontation. It altered it through persistence. By removing an expected point of failure, it disrupted the rhythm upon which planning and counterplanning relied. The enemy did not face a new weapon. They faced an absence of collapse. That absence eroded certainty more effectively than direct challenge. Over time, such patterns fed back into doctrine indirectly. Later designs incorporated greater tolerance. Operating guidance widened quietly. Training emphasized judgment alongside procedure. Not because this specific fix was canonized, but because the war itself filtered out behaviors that could not survive sustained pressure. What remained was practice aligned with constraint. History often favors narratives of decisive moments. Yet industrial conflict advances through accumulation. Small survivals compound. Margins preserved early determine options available later. In that sense, restraint was not the opposite of strength. It was a different expression of it. Strength measured over duration rather than moments. Strength that does not announce itself. When the war is viewed in total, the significance lies not in the ingenuity of the fix, but in what it represented. A shift from demanding maximum performance to managing sustainable function. From expecting machines to conform to ideals, to accepting that ideals must conform to machines. That shift allowed systems to absorb shock without failing outright. It extended operational life into phases where others faltered. The aircraft that flew when others fell silent did not win the war on its own, but it exemplified how wars of scale are sustained: by refusing collapse, by trading spectacle for continuity, by remaining present when absence was assumed, and in wars defined not by isolated engagements, but by relentless duration, that was enough to alter the balance quietly, permanently, and without the need for acknowledgement. What endured was not to fix itself, but the logic behind it, a logic that recognized that survival, multiplied across time, exerts more influence than brilliance exercised once. That understanding, learned under pressure, reshaped how systems functioned and why they lasted. And in the long arc of the war, that persistence mattered more than anyone admitted while it was happening.